So I'm going to use our study as an example because it's a perfect way of illustrating this. Why is it that if cannabis, which is the least toxic of all the drugs in Schedule 1, why does it have the most barriers to research? And so we're going to show you, my argument is that this is kind of classic federal government overreach. Here they are, micromanaging every aspect of efficacy research. So if you want to study any controlled substance in the U.S., these are the 3 agencies you have to go through. We're not objecting to that. That's totally reasonable. But what we are objecting to is that if you look at these 2 examples side by side, take heroin, another Schedule 1 drug, versus cannabis, and what we had to deal with, we had to go through 2 additional layers of federal government red tape that only marijuana is subject to. No other controlled substances had to deal with a public health service review and the NIDA monopoly. You don't go through a monopoly. If you want to buy heroin for a study, you can buy research grade heroin from any lab in the country. So this is a very bizarre situation that cannabis is the least toxic, yet has the most barriers. The Public Health Service review was an absurd experience. It was a redundant review that happens after we've already obtained FDA approval. We had to go through this other process that took us 3 years to get through to address all the mountains of criticism they had about our protocol, unfounded criticism, I would submit. And during that time, 24,000 veterans killed themselves in this country. But ultimately, they approved the study a few days after Sanjay Gupta came out with his Weeds documentary, where he interviewed Nora Volkow at NIDA and asked her why she was blocking these studies, and suddenly we had our approval letter. So it was pretty impressive. And I would say, the good news is from last year, many of you heard that we managed to end the Public Health Service review. So because after we finally did get our approval from PHS, we went through and conducted a very vigorous lobbying effort, showing them how ridiculous this added government red tape was. And Obama administration last year announced the end of this PHS review, fortunately. But sadly, this doesn't end the barriers to research, right? The biggest, so even though our study is fully funded, we've hurdled almost all the federal government obstacles. Yet why can't we get underway? It's because of this, we call it now the DEA mandated NIDA monopoly, because NIDA claims they don't want this monopoly, that they never asked for it. So NIDA, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, has a government-enforced monopoly on the only federally legal supply of whole plant marijuana for any of these federally regulated trials. So if you want to do a clinical trial, any experimental design around whole plant marijuana, you have to buy your cannabis from the University of Mississippi. That's the facility. University of Mississippi was licensed by NIDA through the DEA process. They were given the only license in the country back in 1968. And the challenge is, here's Dr. El Soli. He's the head of that facility in Mississippi. He's got his hand in a barrel of ground up cannabis. That's basically what they do, throw a whole plant into the grinder from root to tip, and they roll it up in these cigarettes, which are sent out to investigators all over the country. So I want to impress upon you, it's not that there's no research happening. There are tons of investigators studying whole plant cannabis from this stock right here. But these are primarily safety studies, right? Looking at harmful side effects of marijuana and addiction potential of marijuana. Very few efficacy studies looking at how effective is marijuana at treating a certain illness. Very few efficacy studies ever get to slip through the system, and that's why we see there's such a paucity of really rigorous research in this country. But when you dump out the contents of those cigarettes, Dr. Rousseau was kind enough to take some pictures for us and show basically, this is what we're getting. This is the study drug that we're required to work with, right? A lot of extraneous plant material. So this is a big cause of concern for a lot of us in the medical community who feel that this study drug potentially sabotages an efficacy study from the beginning, right? Because what we really like to work with is the flowering plant material, where we believe the maximum therapeutic benefit is, but we're unfortunately instead trying to use that. And so they claim that they have a separator now that takes out some of that stuff that you saw, the stems and the sticks and all that, but bottom line is, why do other countries have multiple growers for research? And why is the US one of the few that enforces this single government monopoly? The other countries realize that if you're going to have an adequate and uninterrupted supply, that you have to license multiple growers, and that's what so many other countries have done. If you go to Canada, there's over 10 different growers all able to grow cannabis for research. In Israel, there's 8 different manufacturers licensed by the Minister of Health to do research. So the problem we have, I'll give you some examples of why NIDA marijuana is inadequate, right? If you go on the NIDA website, you'll see that if you want a high THC cannabis, that's defined as 12% THC. So any of you who know about what's happening in the real world know that, especially I'm doing a study on military veterans. I can tell you most of our vets, whether they're buying marijuana from the black market or from a dispensary, they're getting cannabis that's 19 to 25% THC. So we're trying to conduct a real world study and look at what veterans do from day to day, but we're forced to use cannabis that's not more than 12% THC. That's a problem. And so they're required by the control, that's the other thing I want to tell you. And so when we asked them to produce a 1-to-1 ratio of CBD to THC, we said, can you get us a 12%? After 20 months of waiting, they finally said, we can get you about 7%. So the Controlled Substances Act says that they're required to produce a continuous and uninterrupted adequate supply, and I would argue that that's not adequate. The other problem that we have with NIDA is that they don't turn over their drug master file. So that would be an expectation, right, that there would be transparency about how the study drug is grown. Was it grown with pesticide? Are there any other cannabinoids in it besides CBD and THC? That's the only information I get about the study drug. They give you the ratio of CBD to THC. You don't know what terpenes are in it, what flavonoids, nothing. So this is frustrating that they are taking relentless amounts of taxpayer dollars, but not sharing details about how the study drug is, what's in it. And then, of course, this is why the monopoly continues, is because DEA claims that they have a right to the monopoly because of this treaty. International treaty says that there's only one grower, but that wasn't meant to be intended toward research. And so I'll tell you about this, but there was basically a lawsuit that highlighted this further, and a judge said that was a bogus argument from the DEA. So, obviously the treaty is aware that there are other countries that license multiple growers. The treaty hasn't come in and sanctioned these other countries. So HHS, they've already acknowledged that they don't want the monopoly. This is a great thing. We're seeing all these very unlikely allies come forward now, like Nora Volkow. And Kevin Sabet, who's here at this conference somewhere from Project SAM, has stepped forward and said, we believe that the NIDA monopoly should end, the DEA monopoly, and that we should license other growers. And this was a big help to us. I'll say, so what happened was Nora testified at a US Senate hearing last year. It was a big bombshell, and she said, she was interviewed by them and said, do you believe it would be beneficial to allow NIDA to grant more, or the DEA to grant other licenses? And she said, yes, I think it would be beneficial. She went on to say, are you concerned the monopoly is a barrier to research? She admitted, yes, it is a barrier. And she then said it would be better to not have a monopoly. She said, they asked her, does it exist for any other Schedule I drug? And she said, no. She's right. There is no other Schedule I drug that has to deal with this nonsensical situation. So the Controlled Substances Act, here's the language that I was telling you earlier, an adequate and uninterrupted supply of cannabis. So we would argue that this monopoly has been in violation of the Controlled Substances Act for decades now. They've never been able to provide an adequate supply, meaning they haven't been able to provide the strains that scientists are requesting. And so it's not an adequate supply. It's not uninterrupted, because waiting 20 months for marijuana, any expert grower at this conference could have had cannabis grown to spec for us within 3 months. In any, regulated industrial agriculture setting, they should be able to do that. So to wait 20 months and still not be able to get the strains requested is unacceptable. So, yeah, so let me just jump to the end here, and then I'll let everybody else jump in here. Let me just say that the reason that this is such an imperative is because marijuana from NIDA is not authorized to be sold as a prescription medicine. So our goal in trying to do this study is we're trying to put whole plant cannabis through the entire FDA drug development process. We're starting with phase 2, then we go to phase 3. After phase 3, it's possible that the FDA could authorize whole plant to be on the market with an FDA indication if the data is compelling enough. But the problem is that we can't use NIDA marijuana for phase 3, right? NIDA marijuana is only allowed to be used for research purposes, and that means only through phase 2. Once you get to phase 3, you're actually actively in the drug development process, and you end up, producing whatever product you use during phase 3 is the product that goes to market. So we have to end this NIDA monopoly before we enter phase 3, which will be in about 2 years. We'll finish our study, hopefully, if we get our Schedule 1 license in the next couple of months, we should be done with the study in 2 years, and we need to have a source that would allow us, and so basically this is what I wanted to impress upon you, is that right now this is the way that we are being hampered from putting whole plant cannabis through the entire drug development process. As long as a monopoly exists, we're not going to be able to do this. And I just want to point out, my sponsor, MAPS, many of you know, MAPS is a nonprofit based out of Santa Cruz. They've done an incredible job for the last 2 decades of fighting. They won. If you've ever heard of anybody beating the DEA, it's the first time I've heard. In 2001, they actually, on behalf of Professor Craker, who's a world-class plant biologist out of UMass, he petitioned the DEA to license him to grow cannabis for research. The judge actually, back in 2007, then the administrative law judge recommended that the DEA end their monopoly and license other growers, but sadly, the judge 2 years later, the DEA 2 years later rejected their own judge's opinion and decided to keep their monopoly, which they continue to enjoy now. We tried to take them to Court of Appeals and we failed. So the bottom line is, here's the end, is the Attorney General, the DEA really isn't accountable to anybody, clearly. They don't seem to be accountable to the public. Theoretically, they're accountable to the Attorney General, who could step in and urge them to fix this. Drug czar, the president could do an executive order in the same way he did with the Public Health Service review, and he could end this. But we have other unlikely allies besides Nora Volkow and Kevin Sabet. We also have Grover Norquist, one of the big conservatives, that's also said that he believes that the NIDA monopoly is unfair, unjust. He talked about how any agricultural product should be fair game for research. So this is great to have all that. We're hoping that you'll help us in this. That's why we wanted to share this kind of detail with you so you knew what the problems are. Thank you very much.